You stand in a chamber gilded with sunlight, where the scent of rose oil and ink mingle like sin and prayer. The air hums with whispers, each word a blade, each bow a calculation. You don't know it yet, but every smile hides a noose. To rise in this world is to learn how gently power crushes those who reach for it. Across centuries and continents, we still lean toward the same story, the one where ambition wears pearls and danger wears perfume. Where are you watching from tonight? London, Lahore, New York? It's strange, isn't it, how a voice that once echoed through Tudor corridors can still reach you across oceans of time. If you can hear it, if you believe forgotten queens deserve to be remembered, then, like this story, share it and join the circle of those who refuse to let her vanish. Once, before she was a prisoner, Anne Boleyn was the pulse of a kingdom. When she returned from the French court, she carried with her the shimmer of a new world, a grace sharpened by intellect, a poise that frightened as much as it fascinated. She spoke in the language of poets and theologians, quoting scripture and satire with the same sly smile. Henry VIII had seen beauty before, but never a woman who could answer him word for word. Theirs was not love, it was contagion. His obsession burned through treaties, through marriages, through papal decrees. When he looked at Anne, he saw not a mistress but a mirror of his own will. "You have bewitched me, body and soul," he once confessed in a letter smudged with his seal. "I can no longer eat nor sleep, for I am yours." It was a confession, yes, but also a prophecy, for to own a king's heart was to stand before the altar of your own undoing. Years passed, and the court transformed into a theater of her ascent. The Queen, Catherine of Aragon, was banished to her cold palaces. Bishops bent their sermons to favor the king's new cause. Anne walked the corridors like a spark beneath drapes soaked in wine. Her laughter cut through the gloom of ceremony, her wit a weapon against the dull weight of hierarchy. She dared to argue with the scholars, to speak of reform, to mock the superstition of relics and indulgences. To some, she was the dawn of a new England. To others, she was the serpent in its garden. But power breeds envy, and in the silent corners of the court, envy began to gather like rot behind a painted wall. Men smiled as she passed, then whispered after she left. "Too proud," they said. "Too cunning." Every gesture, every glance became evidence of ambition. The king's courtiers, once her allies, now measured their survival in the distance they kept from her. At first, Henry defended her. He spoke of divine right, of providence. He swore she was chosen by God himself. But God, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. The years without a son turned faith into doubt. In 1534, Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, a daughter, with her mother's dark eyes and dangerous intelligence, but to Henry it was a disappointment draped in lace. When a second child was lost, his devotion curdled. He began to look elsewhere. Anne saw it coming. She saw it in the way his hand withdrew first from hers, then from her cause. Nights once filled with laughter turned to silence. The music in the royal chambers quieted. Even the servants began to look through her, as if rehearsing the moment she'd be gone. In public, she wore her crown higher. In private, she prayed until dawn. "Has God abandoned me?" she asked her ladies, "or have I mistaken my husband for God?" Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from revelation. Rumors began to twist around her like vines, that she spoke too freely, that she flirted too easily, that her beauty had been conjured by spells. Some whispered she kept 6 fingers, others that her eyes bewitched the king into blasphemy. Each lie, repeated often enough, became a truth the powerful could use. Letters turned to daggers, friends turned to spies. Cromwell, the king's adviser, watched quietly. He saw the queen's influence waning and his own advantage rising. "The king's conscience," he told a friend, "requires deliverance." It was a phrase that sounded holy and meant murder. By spring of 1536, Anne's body had become a battlefield, her womb a measure of her worth, her silence a threat. The same voice that had once enchanted the king now echoed as defiance in a chamber thick with fear. She still spoke her mind, still challenged him in council, and each time she did, Henry's eyes darkened with something colder than anger, exhaustion. At court, banquets continued, music played, but the laughter was brittle, like glass about to crack. Anne's ladies moved through their duties in uneasy rhythm, unsure which command would be their last. And still Anne refused to fade. She rode out with her head uncovered, met foreign ambassadors with the grace of a queen who knew her end was already being written. On a February morning, as snow fell over the Thames, she stood at her window and watched the barges drift toward Whitehall. Somewhere below, Henry dined with Jane Seymour, her former maid of honor. Somewhere within her, something began to die, something quieter than hope, heavier than despair. When she turned from the window, her eyes were dry. "If I am to fall," she said softly, "let it be for speaking, not for silence." Outside, the bells tolled for Mass. Inside, the Queen straightened her sleeves and went to face the day, not yet knowing that every footstep she took was leading her closer to the Tower. The court applauded her grace that morning. They always did. But beneath the music, beneath the prayers, something ancient and invisible had shifted. Power had chosen its next victim, and Anne Boleyn, England's most dangerous voice, had already begun to walk toward her own echo. The hall of the Tower of London was hushed, but not silent. A murmur thin as the breath of ghosts moved through the air. The scent of wax and damp stone mingled with the metallic tang of armor. In the center of it all stood Anne Boleyn, dressed in a gown of deepest black, her face pale but composed, her hands folded before her like a prayer carved in marble. Around her, the court rustled a forest of silks, and suspicion, every eye fixed upon the woman who had once been the sun of England's court. They had gathered to perform not a trial, but a ritual of erasure. Above the assembled crowd, banners of crimson and gold fluttered weakly in the draught, their brilliance mocking the dim faces below. The Duke of Norfolk presided, a man torn between blood and ambition. His voice trembled only once when he read the charge of treason against his niece. "Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, thou art accused of adultery, conspiracy, and of plotting the king's death." A pause. A silence so heavy it seemed to bend the air. Anne's lips parted, her voice low but clear, each word cut with calm precision. "My lords, if you accuse me of treason, then name the treason. If of adultery, then name the man. If of witchcraft." She allowed herself a faint, bitter smile. "Then show me the mark of the devil upon my skin." A ripple passed through the gallery. Some avoided her gaze, others stared too long as though searching her face for evil. But Anne gave them nothing. No tears, no tremor, no confession. George Boleyn, her brother, stood nearby, bound but unbroken. Their eyes met only once, and in that moment, centuries seemed to pass between them. It was a silent farewell, one only siblings could understand, a vow of shared ruin and shared defiance. The witnesses rose, one by one, each with a story rehearsed in the shadow of the throne. Sir Henry Norris spoke of a smile too warm. Francis Weston recalled a jest mistaken for invitation. Mark Smeaton, trembling and pale, mumbled his confession through lips bruised by fear. His eyes darted toward Anne, then away, drowning in guilt. Anne did not flinch. When the clerk read Smeaton's statement aloud, her only reply was a single, cutting sentence. "I forgive you, Mark. You know not what you do." The Duke of Norfolk shifted uncomfortably, fingers tightening on the edge of the bench. He could not meet her gaze. For a heartbeat, even the king's justice faltered under the weight of her composure. Outside, rain began to fall, thin, cold, relentless. Each drop struck the windows like a knell. Inside, torches flickered, their flames bending as if in submission to a power that was not the court's. Anne's defense was not a plea, but a testament. "If I have been unfaithful," she said, her voice steady, "then may God judge me, not men who are commanded to hate me. I have loved only the king, though he loves me no longer. If that be my sin, I shall bear it gladly." A murmur spread again. The courtiers shifted in their seats. Some crossed themselves. To hear a queen speak of love in a place meant for condemnation unsettled even those who despised her. But the verdict was decided long before the first question was asked. It had been whispered in the king's chambers, written in secret letters, sealed with fear and convenience. When the jurors returned, their faces were grave, as if carved from stone. "Guilty," they said, each word falling like a hammer. George Boleyn was sentenced first. Anne watched, lips pressed to silence as her brother was led away. She did not cry out. Her stillness became unbearable, a mirror held up to their cowardice. Then the sentence turned to her. "To be burned or beheaded, as shall please the king." For a moment her breath caught not from fear, but from the cruelty of the phrase. To live or to burn, to die cleanly or in agony, her fate reduced to a choice made by a man who once swore eternity at her feet. She bowed her head slightly. "Then I must prepare to meet my God," she said softly. As the guards approached, the hall seemed to darken, though the torches still burned. A faint breeze stirred her veil, brushing against her cheek like the ghost of freedom. Anne turned once more toward the lords who had condemned her. "My lords," she said, "I do not hold malice in my heart. You do what you must, as I shall do what I must. But remember, this truth is not buried by verdicts." Her words hung there, a blade of light in the gloom. No one moved. The Duke of Norfolk lowered his eyes. Someone in the gallery wept. As she was led from the chamber, her footsteps echoed down the corridor, fading into the depths of the tower. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air clear and cruel. Within those walls, the empire of rumor triumphed over the empire of reason. But Anne Boleyn's calm, the stillness of a woman already beyond fear, became something immortal. By the time the door closed behind her, the men of the court had already begun to speak of the next queen, the next alliance, the next performance of loyalty. But in the cold silence that followed, it was her voice that lingered. Not the accusations, not the lies. Only the echo of her last words, soft, unbroken, defiant. Truth is not buried by verdicts. And somewhere deep within the tower, the stones themselves seemed to remember. The sky above the tower was the color of unpolished silver, a dawn too soft for the violence it was meant to hold. The air carried the faint scent of rain and straw, mingled with the salt of the nearby Thames. London was barely awake, yet the crows had already gathered along the parapets, black silhouettes against the whitening clouds. Somewhere within the tower's stone belly, Anne Boleyn dressed for her death. She chose a gown of dark gray damask, the fabric simple, almost humble, but her movements were still regal, each gesture measured, precise, deliberate. Her ladies wept as they pinned her sleeves, but she smiled gently as though consoling them. "Do not trouble yourselves," she murmured. "I have been prepared to die long since. The king is merciful to appoint so swift a death." The morning was silent except for the murmuring of prayers. Beyond the walls, people gathered like ghosts, drawn by curiosity as much as pity. No drums, no trumpets, only the occasional flutter of wings and the low hum of anticipation. The French swordsman stood nearby, hooded and calm, his blade hidden in a bundle of straw. He had been brought from Calais for his skill a single stroke, clean as light, Henry's final gift to his former queen. Inside her chamber, Anne knelt in prayer. Her lips moved silently, but the sound of her heartbeat filled the room. Did she think of Elizabeth, the daughter she would never see again? Did she think of the man she had once loved, whose name she would not curse even now? No one could say, but those who stood near her that morning said she radiated a peace so strange it felt otherworldly, as though she had already crossed the threshold between this life and whatever waited beyond. When the constable of the tower entered, she rose without hesitation. "Madam," he said, his voice faltering, "the time has come." "I am ready," she replied. The walk from her chamber to the scaffold was brief, yet it seemed to stretch into eternity. The courtyard opened before her, pale sunlight spilling across the weathered stones. She walked without falter, her back straight, her chin lifted. The crowd parted in silence as she passed merchants, soldiers, courtiers, all watching the woman who had once ruled their king's heart. Some crossed themselves, others bowed. She climbed the wooden steps and turned to face them. For a moment the wind lifted her veil, and her dark hair caught the light like polished jet. She spoke softly, her voice clear, steady, almost tender. "Good Christian people," she began, "I come hither not to accuse any man, nor to speak aught of that whereof I am accused. I die in the faith of Christ, and I beseech you all to pray for the king, for he is a gracious and gentle prince." There was no bitterness in her tone, no accusation, only grace the kind that wounds those who witness it. The executioner bowed deeply before her, murmuring in French, "Madame, I crave your grace's pardon." She smiled faintly. "Willingly," she answered, and from my heart a hush fell. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Anne removed her headdress, tucking her hair beneath a linen cap so the blade would not be hindered. Then she knelt on the straw, her hands folded, her eyes lifted to the sky. No priest came to bless her. No husband stood to see her die. Only the birds watched, shifting restlessly on the tower's ledge. The swordsman whispered to his assistant, who stepped forward, distracting her briefly with the movement of a hand. In that instant, the blade flashed a single arc of steel cutting through the dawn. There was no cry, no struggle, only the thud of the sword upon flesh and the gentle sigh of a body collapsing into silence. A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief mingled with awe. The executioner lifted the blade once more, saluting the fallen queen, and then stepped back. Her ladies rushed forward, wrapping the body in linen. One of them fainted. Another whispered, "She died like a saint." The head was placed within a small casket, the body beside it. No monument, no royal mourning. By midday, her remains were carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and buried beneath the floor, unmarked, as if she had never been queen at all. But even as the stones were sealed above her, something lingered. Those who served in the tower claimed that in the evenings after, a faint light flickered along the path to the scaffold. The guards heard footsteps soft, rhythmic, deliberate as though a woman in silk still walked there. And on certain mornings when the mist rose from the river, it seemed to take the shape of a figure kneeling in prayer. Across England, life went on. The king remarried within days. Bells rang for celebration, not mourning. Yet beneath the noise, a rumor began to stir that the woman they had killed had not truly died, that her name would outlive them all. And so it did. Anne Boleyn's last breath was not an ending, but an awakening the moment a mortal woman became a legend carved in air and silence. Her death marked the birth of something far greater, a child destined to rule the world she never could, and a legacy that would whisper through centuries. The Frenchman wiped his blade clean. The crowd began to disperse, but history had already written its judgment. Power had silenced her voice, yes, but not the echo it left behind. It would travel through the ages, through ink and blood, through daughters and dynasties, until one truth remained unshaken. A queen may die in silence, but her story never does.